Good morning.
So how many people here have seen our Nixon?
Cool.
Okay. How many people here are filmmakers? Okay, well that helps us know, but how many people are here with films that you're still making now? And how many people have films that are made that you're trying to figure out the release and the strategy and that kind of stuff? Okay, so there's still a lot of, the creative part in the beginning makes a lot of sense. Why don't you start, Brian, in terms of the, give a quick rundown of the origin of sort of how the film where it came from.
So in about 2000, I was teaching, visiting professor at Hampshire College, and the guy gave me a ride, Bill Brand, was preserving these Super 8 home movies, the Nixon staff Super 8 home movies, for the National Archives, and he knew I was interested in amateur film, so he told me about them and showed me a reel of them, while I was, while he was working on them. And I wrote a short article about them, sort of tongue-in-cheek article about them for Cineast, sort of talked about them to anyone who was interested, because it just was a fascinating kind of collection of things that I really wanted to see. But at the time, it was just cost prohibitive to get real access to them. They had money to preserve the films, but they were never transferred to video, so they kind of just sat there unwatched for a long time. And when I met Penny at the Flaherty conference in 2008, told her about it, and to make a long story short, she basically said, "That's great, we better collaborate, because if you don't make this movie, then I will." So.
Well, he just kept talking about how he was going to, and I get really,
talker.
I was really bored of hearing about it. I was like, I'm going to take your idea. So.
Yeah, so we went ahead and just invested about $20,000 in making the initial video transfers, and that was without ever really seeing any of the material. So we had no idea what was going to be on the film when we paid for the transfers, and we got this box full of tapes. This was back when there were still tapes, and just sat down and watched them for a week at the Yaddo colony. And
why don't you explain where the films came from?
oh, right. Sorry. Yeah. So the Super 8 home movies were made by Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Chapin. So H.R. Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff and longtime member of sort of Nixon's teams, dating back to when he was vice president. Ehrlichman was a lawyer who came on initially during the campaign, then became White House counsel, and then eventually domestic advisor for policy affairs. And Dwight Chapin was Nixon's, essentially his appointment secretary. So he's a young guy who was scheduling the president's day. And basically between 1969 and 1973, when they all resigned and eventually went to prison, they collectively shot about 25 hours of Super 8, silent Super 8 home movies. Haldeman was getting film from the Naval Photographic Center for free. They would give them the film, process the film, make prints for them. And kind of what we surmise was that Haldeman was distributing the film, getting the film back, having it processed, making it prints, and then giving everyone prints of the stuff. And when Ehrlichman resigned and the FBI seized the contents of his office, there was a copy of the films in Ehrlichman's office, and they became part of the National Archives in that way. All that material, all of the material confiscated during the Watergate investigation went to the National Archives. So that's how the material came to be owned by the government, and eventually the Congress nationalized all the papers created, all documents created by the Nixon White House.
So Penny, so once you saw this, then the idea is, okay, wow, what is this? What do we do with this?
So yeah, so as Brian mentioned, we had a residency at Yaddo, and we sat in a room and just watched these home movies for a couple weeks. And I think the first thought was, wow, this is so amazing. And then the second thought was, oh my God, it's so boring. Because it's really repetitive. It's super repetitive. I mean, it's like Haldeman filmed the exact same things over and over and over again in the exact same way. And, endless shots of Nixon giving a speech, and you're like, it's silent, I don't know what he's saying, So there's this big wall between us and the images, and I think that even though we should have known better, we did have kind of this idea that they would be so intimate. And if you've seen the film, in a way, they're not. They're kind of mysterious and over there because there's such a distance between us and that scene. There's no, especially because there's no sound. So I think really early on, we started playing with using parts of the White House tapes, the White House audio tape recordings, because those actually provided the sense of intimacy and being there that the movies themselves kind of try to do but can't do on their own.
When did you, backing up one second, I'm sorry, when did you bring Francisco on?
So we worked on our own for the first year. I mean, we really didn't have any idea what kind of a film we were making. We thought we'd make the whole thing for very little money. We'd do everything ourselves. We'd show it in a very small way in like the art film world. That was our initial vision. And we did a Kickstarter campaign and started to get the idea that more people than just the sort of small circle that we came from, we thought would be interested in the film. We thought maybe it was too weird, the idea of an all-archival home movie film. And also we thought, does anyone care about Nixon anymore? You know, like what's there left to say about Nixon? It turns out everybody cares about Nixon. I had no idea that people still cared so much about Nixon. So that was something we found out from doing a Kickstarter campaign, and that was the first, I think, major lesson was that the Kickstarter campaign was, it was initially, let's pay ourselves back for this $20,000 we just spent on these home movies because we're kind of broke. But what it really became was this kind of market test, and we really amped up our ambitions and our ideas about what the film could be based on that market test in a sense. So that's the first lesson, was that a Kickstarter campaign is not just like to get some money. The money we raised in the long run is very incidental to our overall budget. Francisco came on, to answer your question, a year into the process after we had been editing on our own and had kind of like hit a wall creatively. And the first grant money we got was explicitly to hire an editor and to get us out of that hole.
Well, I interrupted what you were saying then in terms of as you were first approaching the footage, and so I didn't know if Francisco was part of that or not, but I didn't know if did you want to, Brian, say what you were thinking before? Okay. And so would you like, is it worth talking at all about how you worked together and then it changed once Francisco came on or not, or should we move to?
Yeah, it's probably not that interesting. I mean, we just talked a lot. We lived in the same house at the time, so we just talked a lot. I was the person that had the Final Cut Pro knowledge, so technically I was editing, but we were doing a lot of it together. And I think the way that the film evolved was this pure idea, just going to use the home movies. 100% of this imagery will be home movies. And then moving on from that idea and saying, no, we want to tell a story, and these home movies don't tell the story. They tell a very small part of the story, it turns out. So then bringing in the White House tapes, and then adding to that, and then slowly bringing in the interviews with the three main characters, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Chapin, and then the last layer, which is what Francisco, where you came in, I think, was about halfway into the process of figuring out how to use news footage to kind of contextualize all the rest of it. So when Francisco came into it, we had this kind of horrible cut, but it did have most of the elements of what's in the film now in terms of the pieces. If we didn't say it very clearly, everything in the film is archival, so we didn't shoot anything and we didn't do any of the interviews, but there's a lot of interviews in the film.
Yeah, the cut that I saw had White House tapes, but I thought critically didn't show the main characters in any context other than shots where they incidentally happen to appear on camera on Super 8. So the distinction to keep in mind here is that they're the shooters. They are behind the camera. They're often shooting themselves, but often in relation to the number of hours of footage was not that much. And so there was this great historical, sweep of history that sort of touches these guys. And I felt that if you didn't see these guys on camera, if you didn't really push the news coverage of the period, that was getting lost. And also, because there's three different guys, three very different personalities, three men who came out of the experience completely differently, by not seeing them, you were sort of losing track of who they were and going individually and collectively as well. And so if you didn't know what Ehrlichman looked like when he zipped by, in the caravan, you wouldn't know. So there was sort of a formal and pragmatic reason I felt to introduce these posthumous interviews, but have them appear on camera, so that when you see the John Ehrlichman, in the future, bearded, looking a little bit more wary, and you see him as a younger man, the connection is made. And there was also the larger question in their arc of how to broadcast their downfall, whether or not to do it at the beginning of the film, which many viewers already knew, but also younger viewers quite often, more often than not, didn't even know who they were. And so what did it do to sort of cast a shadow over the Super 8 home movie footage, which is overwhelmingly bright and cheerful, and over the course of the film gets a darker cast. But what is the role of starting to cast those shadows really early on in the film so that they sort of shade how you see this material? And those were the things that were really on the table. When I saw the cut, it was just the Super 8 movies, their narration off screen, a little bit of news, not that much. And I was feeling, this was a once in a lifetime film. I have to do everything in my power to convince Penny and Brian to hire me. And two, how do we get that a little bit closer to what I felt that audiences would demand, and that is tracking these guys.
That, which is that Brian and I, our original idea was that we were never going to say Watergate, ever, and that we were going to ask the viewer to bring that to the story, which is a really nice idea, but didn't really work. No, and what happened was that viewers didn't trust us. It's sort of like, what do you not know? You found these home movies. Yeah, kids these days. You found these home movies and you're like, what a bunch of nice guys. And we were like, no, we think that you know, and we think that you should do. Never mind. It didn't work. And that was sort of still what was going on when we came to Francisco. We were trying desperately to avoid making another Nixon movie that hit all the same points as every other Nixon movie, because the whole point of these home movies is that they were new and supposed to be different. So the balancing act, I think, for us really in the end was twofold. One was how much Watergate is enough, because every other Nixon movie is just about Watergate. So we kind of think a lot of this already. We do think our audience is intelligent. And then B, how to make this very personal story come through when people are used to thinking about this story very differently in a kind of bigger picture historical way. How do you make people care about Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Chapin in the midst of all this important historical stuff?
To me, one of the, and this is maybe too rudimentary and simple, but another layer that I love so much about the film is just how it exposes a difference in media, how media naive we used to be, how open everybody was. And was that something you were conscious about, or it was just so obvious it was just, you didn't even have to think about it?
Penny and Brian were very well aware of these little mini narratives because they just knew the material so well. They had studied the history up and down, which as an editor is just a wonderful thing to have that resource when the directors really know their subject. And what was interesting is that there were recurring motifs that were already beginning to have their seed planted in the cut that I saw, but then as we worked on it, sort of really developed. And that's this recurring element of Richard Nixon having these follow-up conversations with Haldeman about how good his speech was and what was the reaction to it. And the other one, which was interesting, was the overall arc of the relationship between the media and Richard Nixon himself, particularly through Dan Rather, who starts giving this really interesting, year one recap of Nixon, which is generally favorable. And then gradually the knife just kind of goes in deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yeah, the first time you hear Dan Rather's voice, he's like, Nixon, the supremely disciplined, he's saying all these great things about him, and then by the end of the film, you can guess what he's saying about him.
And that was one of the nice things about working more of the news footage is that you really feel how close the public narrative and the private narrative, the internal narrative of the Nixon administration and the public narrative of the American sort of gestalt, how close they actually were at the beginning of the presidency, and they gradually pull apart. And I think a lot of the people inside the administration just didn't see to what extent the American public didn't trust them anymore.
And even just outside of politics, it's a time when everybody didn't have iPhone cameras. So it's just a time when everybody was used to being filmed differently. But
Yeah.
So then, okay, so was it hard to do? Oh.
I was going to say, there actually is a really interesting privacy story to the film as well, because I think what a lot of people don't fully realize is that, at the time that they were creating these documents, everyone in the Nixon administration had every reason to think that executive privilege of the president, this was personal property of Richard Nixon and the people who made it, that it would never be made public, right? And they had every reason to think that they would be able to control that narrative. And, it really is this sort of it's sort of like the same kind of thing that can happen with the internet when things become public for the world. It's just in this case, it was Congress did it instead of the internet. But
Was it hard to know when it was done? And then the second part of that is, in terms of how you decided to release it into the world, how did you figure out that strategy?
Weirdly, I don't think it was that hard to figure out when it was done. I feel like we were showing the cut in iterations, and I have like a kind of a philosophy of rough cut screenings, and I think luckily Francisco agreed with it. But I don't like to do them too early at all, because when the movie's not in any way there, people are like, I don't know, whatever. But we got to a point where we had very specific questions, and the first kind of round of rough cut screenings was for very young people, and we were specifically trying to find out, like, how much context do we need to add to this story? That was the only question we were asking at that point. So, the typical younger person today, including myself, by the way, I'm not even that young, had no idea that Richard Nixon going to China was a big deal in 1972. I'm just gonna confess, I didn't know. I was like, they filmed a lot in China, like, really? And Brian was like, well, it's a big deal. Okay, so young people didn't know that, so we had to add news footage. People had to say, the newscaster had to say, like, this is a historic, momentous moment, in order to understand why they were filming a lot in China. Anyway, so later rough cut screenings, as it got toward the end, basically, once we got to the point where we had 2 screenings in a row where all the feedback was the same, and we could answer to it. We're done. And then there was a kind of a phase where the film was, and this is like kind of a more private thing, I guess, but there was a period where we got a lot of negative feedback, and then we had to have like a little crisis, like, well, do we stand by? I remember calling Francisco after crying for an hour.
This is a conversation that I have often with the directors.
He's like totally prepared for this, right? He was like, well, we didn't get into the first festival we applied to. Like, we must have made a terrible movie. We should go back to the edit room. And then he was like, no, we stand by this. We know this is done. So.
yeah, we had somewhat different reactions.
Yeah. Brian didn't care.
So what about your release strategy? You premiered at Rotterdam, yes?
Yeah, we didn't, I think to say that we had a strategy is overstating the case. I really do think that there is a sort of strategy to that process, but it's not, it's like everyone's is the same,
There has to be an intent, and then you have to deal with the hand
reality.
you're dealt. Yeah.
And the
there's a
gray
certain
hairs
randomness.
come from thinking you can have a strategy around your release, and then getting really freaked out when, like, not everything happens exactly the way you think it's going to. That was really, that was the hardest time in this whole process for me, because I was trying so hard to have any amount of planning. You can't plan anything when you're just sort of waiting to know.
And it was super frustrating to be done with the movie.
Oh, and just sitting on
not
it.
able to share it with
The movie was sitting there done since like June or something, almost done in June. So yeah, we world premiered at Rotterdam, which I think was really great because, as I mentioned before, Brian and I both come from kind of an art background, an art film background, and Rotterdam is considered like a real premiere showcase for art film. So for us to premiere in that context was, I think, really good because it sort of kept us linked to the world that we actually had come from before. And nobody in America really cared that we were in Rotterdam because it wasn't, I don't know. And then we came to South by Southwest in March, which was amazing.
Well, we cared at South by Southwest.
Yeah.
We cared, it just wasn't a deal breaker.
Right, yeah.
But we met it in our context. We met at Creative Capital, which has a retreat,
Yeah.
which is a great artist support organization out of New York that's fantastic. And that's where the film became on my radar when I first heard about it there.
So then, yeah, so we had a sales agent, and the sales agent shopped the film around at South by Southwest, like during that week, and by the end of that week, had gotten us 2 deals, one with CNN Films and one with Cinedigm.
So Courtney, why don't you, CNN Films is new, and why don't you let everybody know a little bit about it?
Yeah, thank you. So CNN Films started actually last year, and the idea early on was to do a few films each year, and they would be films that we either commission or acquire or put in finishing financing, and it was going to be kind of, a smaller strand within the channel. And very quickly, it became 10 to 12 films. So now we'll basically be releasing a film a month, and the idea behind it is that we are going out to artists and filmmakers who are making beautiful films like this, going out to filmmakers and asking them to make films on particular topics or stories. But we really want it to look and feel like a film strand. It's not going to be your typical made-for-TV film. So our Nixon was a perfect film for this because it's the unexpected. I mean, it's expected because it's Nixon and it's CNN, but it's unexpected because it is really this beautiful piece of art, and that these are the types of films that we want to represent what we're doing. So we're still very new, but over the course of the next year, hopefully the brand will really be defined, and when you go to CNN and you see one of these films, you'll realize like how special it is, and it's just a pleasure to have this film, and it's been a huge success for the channel, and I think has really set the tone for where we're going.
Well, so are you actively sort of working on differentiating the fact that you're supporting artists' visions, filmmakers' visions, as opposed to CNN? It wouldn't be stock, it would be like a CNN-produced.
Absolutely. I mean, the stuff they're doing internally is fantastic and is a huge part of what we do, but we want people to come to the channel too for entertainment, and that can often be a different style of filmmaking than news-driven, and we feel that you have to go out to the community, you have to go out to the people that are making these stories and laboring over them for years, and really finding the most interesting ways into them. So yes, it will be different.
Did you get feedback on how did it work for you with ratings or feedback?
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers, but I do know that it was, I think, one of the most successful we've had so far, and continued to get a lot of online traffic. People are still talking about it. I think people were surprised by it. You know, there's still a lot of work to do on our end as we build it, but everybody was incredibly happy with how it turned out.
Rob Lowe really liked it. Rob Lowe live tweeted it, so that was good.
Well, for both Penny and Brian, in terms of, so you said Cinedigm and CNN, so maybe you want to explain what Cinedigm is and how does it work to have two different deals? What's involved with that?
Sure. So the CNN Films deal is our broadcast deal. It's you know, where the film will be showing in North America on television for the next few years. And Cinedigm is our North American everything else deal. So theatrical, digital, DVD, whatever gets invented like next month that we don't, I'm sure we gave that to them too, whatever it will be. But yeah.
Cinedigm used to be New Video?
New Video, yeah. So Cinedigm is also kind of a new company that came out of, or I think is a merger. I mean, I should have someone here to explain that. But yeah, it used to be called New Video, and now it's Cinedigm. And they're wonderful. They've been amazing. They've been totally great in every way for us. And yeah, so the two deals just mean they had to dovetail, right? Like we had to go back and forth a lot and make sure that we weren't giving the same rights to two different entities. And the big point of, you know, of things we had to figure out had to do with the theatrical release, which, you know, initially we were going to have before the CNN broadcast, but then ended up being after the CNN broadcast, which is very unusual. And that became kind of just a big, you know, it was sort of just had to happen that way just because of a bunch of scheduling things. Essentially, it was like a practical thing. But, you know, the question of whether the CNN broadcast, like, ruined the theatrical release or fueled the theatrical release is kind of yet to be determined.
So still, I mean, I've always known, as much as distribution has changed, Windows was always a huge aspect of it. And now it's even more than Windows because it's different areas. But is there anything that you learned from this experience that you feel like sharing to sort of, or you'll be paying more attention to next time? Certainly you just brought up the idea of timing, but.
Well, I mean, you know, again, I think it's important for, I would say probably at least documentary filmmakers, I can't speak for anything else, to understand that your broadcast is probably, if you're going to make any money, that's where you're going to make it. So, I mean, is that a terrible thing to say? I just think it's a reality. So if you're not aware of that reality, you should know. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that increasingly really smart sales agents are going to break your broadcast deal out from the all rights deal and keep it separate, because otherwise, well, think about it this way: if we had just gone with Cinedigm and then they had made the deal with CNN Films or another broadcaster, they would then get a big chunk of that money. We would not, right? So I think that's, I feel like I'm sharing really big secrets, but hopefully that's okay for you guys and you're happy about that and no one's mad.
I mean, it's an interesting to talk about on distribution panels. You know, if the theatrical distributors don't have rights that bring in income, they can't continue working either. You know, so it's a very broken system at this point, and everybody's exploring how to do it. And so, you know, for you, you've already had a successful broadcast, and then it'll be interesting. You don't know yet whether digital or VOD could potentially nobody talks about those numbers, but of course we're all dying to know what they are and how successful they are. Is there a different, do you have any sense of, I don't know how you would have the feedback of how people are the difference of what they're looking for in television and theatrically? Kind of the expectations of the audience and the success, how that
This is a
reads.
loaded question.
Yeah, what do you think, Francisco? Have you seen anything? Yeah, woof.
Yeah, so there was some chatter online after the broadcast. There was some chatter online after the broadcast that the film wasn't, I don't know if it would be right to say newsy enough. And
It
because
wasn't journalistic, right? I mean, I think that's the way to put it.
yeah, and because essentially it's the same film that was shown in festivals and with commercial breaks formatted for television, and people that were coming to the film, not everyone, but there were some vocal folks online saying that it didn't meet those expectations, and so it spurred this debate, among us, which is a film like this. What do you do with it? And at CNN Films, I'm sure you guys are dealing with this, rather often. You can argue either way. What is an expectation going to a film that's in film festivals, and what's expectation of a film that appears on television, specifically on one that's so journalistically centered?
Right, and it's new, right? Yeah. So the whole concept of, I'm channel flipping and I land on CNN, and what am I thinking I'm about to see?
Well, and that's
an
our job.
artist's vision of a film isn't necessarily right now like what people are thinking they're going to see.
I mean, and I think CNN is a unique platform where people do go there for the news, where if they landed on this on HBO, there might be a different expectation, but again, that comes back to our responsibility over the next year, and is really educating people that CNN Films is something different than anything else that you're seeing, and that takes time for people to understand, but hopefully when they see more films like yours, and they'll get it, and it'll make sense, and it'll be a welcome pleasure to come to the channel and see something that's historical, but also through a different viewpoint.
I mean, my sense has certainly been that the people who seem to have the most negative reaction to the film are those who are most ideologically polarized. So people who have something really deeply invested in hating Nixon or hating Obama, apparently, which I mean, I find it.
We don't even know how that became a thing.
It's like a meme.
But
now.
like
It's so
hashtag
weird.
our Nixon is now about Benghazi, by the way. It is. That happened. So people are like, Watergate was nothing. Hashtag our Nixon. Our Obama's way worse. Hashtag Benghazi. And you're like, okay, cool. I think that never would have happened without a certain kind of audience that we found with CNN, which is cool.
Yeah.
I think that's a really cool discussion to have, even if it's not one that we thought we were going to have.
But I think interestingly, the kind of the broad people, the broad middle, as it were, I've been pleasantly surprised to see how thoughtful and receptive people have been. And actually, I feel like some of the most interesting commentary on the film has come not from the sort of film criticism, TV criticism crowd, but from policy people who are actually really sophisticated viewers of movies like this.
Yeah, and I would also add, I mean, it's not just the context of appearing on a news network. It also is part of the larger debate that's going on in the documentary community at large about how many degrees of artistic license, some might say fictionalization, fiction techniques that are being in documentaries. It's a very interesting time that we're in, and we just happened in this particular film to get caught up in those wins as well. And the debate is healthy,
I love that debate. The whole idea of documentary truth drives me crazy. I mean, there is such a thing, but I like to hear people talk about it as much as possible. We'll go to questions in 1 minute, but right, the last thing before we do, in terms of how you got attention for the film. I mean, you have different stages. You have to get attention for it when you're at your festival release, and then afterwards. And so, is there anything you want to share about how you? Because I know you were really active. I remember seeing you at South by Southwest. You had, you were always talking to people about it. But who you reached out to, what kind of groups, how you?
So we, again, had really good fortune, and with the initial Kickstarter campaign, it was strange to us that so many people in the news community were interested in our film from that point. So that's something else to keep in mind. When you put that Kickstarter campaign out there, you are putting your film out for the first time. And I don't think enough people realize that. So be prepared, to have people write to you and ask you to write stories or whatever. So the interest started early, and our process was mainly holding back interest until we had a film that was actually going to be showing it to people. So what we did was, you know, the Colbert Report and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times are all writing to us like in March of 2011, we have no movie yet. And they're like, we want to do stories. And we're like, well, no, no one's going to be able to see the film. Like, so why would we do a story now? Like, so we held back most of that interest until way later. The South by Southwest was where we started doing like a major press push, still holding back certain outlets for when we would have either the CNN broadcast or the theatrical run. And then it became a competition between our various publicists who were fighting over the major coverage for either the broadcast or the theatrical, which is something that they could talk about, I'm sure, better than me. But that became the last phase, was like finally letting the big things happen to the extent that it did.
Well, in terms of identifying, so there's film press, there's policymakers. I mean, how do you sort of, what were the groups that you identified that you were trying to reach out to? Can you kind of run off a list, or?
Sure. I mean, so there, initially it was sort of historians and, you know, again, like before
Archivists?
Yeah, the archival community was really excited about the film. But this is again before we realized anyone cared about Nixon. So we were like really pushing the like home movie, amateur film, like archival nature of it, and then finally realized that people are obsessed. The news media itself, like by large, is obsessed with Nixon because it's sort of like one of these big foundational stories about journalism and da-da-da. So we had the good fortune, here's a good piece of advice, pick a story that news people are obsessed with and you will have no problem finding press.
Especially because the movie is so much about the press's relationship to Nixon and to the Nixon administration. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a movie about them, as well as it is a movie about the administration, and that's like candy for them.
It's fantastic. Any questions from the audience? Yes? Hi.
Why did you try Indiegogo?
Oh, it was early on. I don't even think Indiegogo existed at that point, or if it did, it was new.
But
it was new. It was newer, and it didn't have as much sort of steam behind it. I mean, when we talk about Kickstarter in March of 2011, I think it's hard for us to even remember now how few people I knew at that point who had ever used Kickstarter. I was certainly not getting an email a day about campaigns. So it was so new. We didn't know if it was going to work at all.
Yeah, there was an article in 2012, I guess. There was a big article about Kickstarter that pointed out that about 30 of the South by Southwest projects all had some, but that was the first time people realized there were that many, and Sundance only had about 12 at the time.
Well, and that was huge,
that was
right?
Just a year
because
ago.
It was also a way of credentialing the platform, because there was a perception at that time that it was like sort of like, oh, if you can't do like a movie the normal way because you're kind of but you're kind of a loser, then you go to crowdfunding because you can't get any other funding. And that was really kind of like a very public perception. But the minute that first year of like Sundance, South by, Tribeca happened, and like basically half the films had also used this platform, in addition to everything else, it's important to say that we only raised about total 10% of our budget from Kickstarter. It was seed money, and actually talk about that really quickly.
But and I think what Penny said before, and I'm not as familiar with Indiegogo, but my sense, having looked at projects in both platforms, is that Kickstarter is just better curated, especially from a filmmaker's perspective. They have a vision of what a successful Kickstarter campaign looks like and what it's for, and they, I think, deeply understand that it's not just about raising money, it's about creating a narrative of your project, finding your audience, communicating with your audience, and frankly, teaching artists how to be entrepreneurial. And that really made sense to us, and they will identify projects that show that the person doing the project understands what they're after, what they're kind of getting at. And I think they'll select a project and feature it, and that really helps you become especially successful as well.
When that article came out that there were so many more films involved with Kickstarter at South by Southwest, and first we thought it was like, oh, because we don't pay anybody, we don't bring filmmakers in, the costs are on them, and we're like, oh, that really looks bad for us. And then we realized, no, it's because we are so close to the DIY movement, and filmmakers taking the tools into their own hands, trying new modalities, and we realized that was going on. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Hi.
This is very related to the conversation. So one of the things people have to do now is to sort of already have their constituency when they launch a Kickstarter. Like you have to have your database if you're going to send emails to. So I'm curious, Penny and Brian, what was the list that you had, and how did that list, by what means did that list grow? Either strategically you planned it or was out of the blue?
That's an awesome question. So we planned that campaign for 3 months. I think that's really important to say, like 3 months of like serious thought. And the first thing we did was we created an email list. We went on MailChimp, we set up a free email list service, it's fantastic. And the two of us literally sat for weeks and thought about, we had both been making films for a long time. And so I'd never done this before. This was a great kick in the pants. Like all the programmers who'd ever shown my films at film festivals, all the curators who'd ever written about Brian's films or put his film in the Whitney Permanent Collection, like all our friends and family and everything else. So we started off with a personal email list of about 1,200 people, I think, between the two of us. Being able to combine was really good, because I probably didn't have, like each of us only had 600. So anyway, but we also had a plan to just like send, we realized that, you know, who needs content? Everyone on the internet. And like sending someone a short, like blog ready, like, hey, this thing is happening with a cool picture, people will put that on their blog. Like everybody is trying to put content everywhere all the time. So we had that same list, and it was before we realized Nixon was interesting. So we were still doing like home movie enthusiasts and historians and archivists and, you know, that kind of stuff. And so that was the next phase, was just sending that blog ready, Twitter ready, you know, Facebook ready thing to all those people, most of whom we just literally pulled off the internet, like by Googling Home Movie Enthusiasts Association or something.
No, and you know, Penny just did an incredible job managing.
I stayed up all night, like
managing
every night.
that campaign, and I think that realization, it makes me sad every time I get an email or see a Facebook posting from someone saying, "We almost have enough money. Give us more money."
Please,
'Cause
please, please.
that's not a story. Okay? No one is interested in telling other people how you need money. They're interested in something interesting. And everyone knows what these campaigns are for. Everyone relevant to you knows if it's a Kickstarter, it means there's an opportunity to get involved, right? You need to give people a story that they want to tell other people about.
That's great. Yeah, the only not unique story is I'm a filmmaker and I need money. Like, oh, really? Like, oh, wow, that's a great story. Let's post that on our blog. Right, I really think that's important. Like, we really always had the attitude that we were not begging. That's not what we were doing. We were doing something really cool, and we were asking people to be a part of it. And I think that if you adopt the begging
Giving people an
mentality,
opportunity
yeah,
to be a part of it.
To be involved. And people were actually really excited to be involved and see early clips that no one else could see, and, you know, get cool merchandise that we had really been thoughtful about coming up with and all that kind of stuff.
More questions? Yes. Mm-hmm.
I am very interested in how you're talking about your fine art background, and you just come from this world, and it seems like it's in its final form kind of an interdisciplinary sort of thing. Like you seem to be keeping legs in different arenas.
Yeah, Brian's also a law professor, just to confuse you even more.
So I'm just curious about how the art world has responded to the film. What's that like to like make a sort of clear documentary genre film, and like are they hostile to it? Are they like, oh, we do want to program this in a museum context or whatever? How does that work?
Well, we won the top prize at Ann Arbor, which is an experimental film festival. So that was great. I mean, because I had a lot of the same questions, like whether we were kind of, by the end of the film, like whether we had still made a film that our kind of art film community would still like. And I think pretty much they have. I mean, it's not...
Some yes, some
Some
no.
yes, some no. Yeah, I mean, there are some people who think this is an experimental film, and I'm like, you haven't seen experimental films. Like, seriously. Like, this movie is, like, entertaining and tells a story in a really compact way. You know, I mean, yes, it's made of these weird archival sources, but I don't know. I mean, I think our influences are there, and people who care about our work from before can still see us in the work. Like, this is still totally our voice, even though it's a completely different format. So some people, yeah, some people no.
I mean, there's a precedent for this kind of film. I think a lot of Jem Cohen's stuff, you know, someone who really has walked that line and also uses Super 8. Maybe it's the sort of unconventional nature that it's found footage that appeals to people that are a little more outside the box, but then it's Nixon.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that really excited me when from day one that I saw this, I was thinking this film could potentially walk that line.
We put it in the section that we reserve for films that are more innovative or playing with the form, or unusual, you know, kind of like that are not conventional. And there's something in it. Is the section we actually think is the one that people look to the most at our festival.
It's called Visions, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, yes. Yes.
Broadcasters are increasingly wanting digital rights, so I'm curious to know how you and CNN and Cinedine worked out the divide on that.
Could everybody hear that broadcast? She's saying that broadcasters increasingly want digital rights. So how did they work out that division?
Yeah, I mean, to
It's
be honest, I think
complicated.
our sales agent really was involved with those negotiations more than we were.
I mean, we were involved.
we were
We just
involved,
didn't know what they were
but-
talking about.
Yeah.
So I said, that sounds great.
My guess is
Honestly,
that it's something that is changing literally every day, and that people are feeling it their way through.
I remember that it was the part of the contracts that was discussed the longest, and I think it is because there are some digital rights with CNN and others with Cinedigm, and they had to kind of work it out. I mean, we had to work it out with them, but it was our lawyer. We paid her very well so that I wouldn't have to worry about that.
Can CNN talk about what they want or what they were asking?
Well, we're actually, I mean, this is a conversation that we're having internally right now and trying to figure out what makes the most sense for what we do and what would work for us. But I have to say, every broadcaster is different, so it's not just what CNN wants. It's you kind of have to. It's individually what kind of deal you're in. So I don't want to speak to what those are because it is happening, but it's definitely something as a filmmaker you really want to pay attention to and make sure you understand what's the best deal for your film. So.
That's why you want a sales agent.
Yeah, well,
Can't say it
and also I
enough
would say,
times.
it's why you need a lawyer. Seriously. I mean, if you think you can negotiate this stuff on your own, you're an idiot. I'm a law professor.
You're a lawyer. You still can't do it.
Oh, I don't want to.
No,
I mean,
and
it's
also, who wants
foolish.
to? It's so
No,
boring.
it's not. It's foolish. It's foolish because you don't know the business. You can't negotiate at arm's length. You need a lawyer.
Well, and it really is changing so much, and there are, you have to understand the context, and you have to understand how it's worked and kind of where it's going. Some more questions? Yes?
Pick up on the thread of what you're talking about, Janet's task of getting attention. So you mentioned sales agent. So bring us through, at what point did you bring on a sales agent? Was it pre-Rotterdam? What was your feeling about this nascent endeavor that Courtney is tasked with, CNN Films? You saw it as a art film. They are not an art entity. So the trepidation, and what are, in a sense, the restrictions? Does it have platform? Does it have to be broadcast first on CNN before CNN? What was the? So could you go through a little bit more in detail? When did you bring on a sales agent, and what was the status of the film starting there? How far?
Sure.
How finished was it?
This could be a whole other conversation, so I'll try to be brief. Our sales agent was Josh Braun from Submarine. We brought him on in around October of last year, so it was before we had a festival premiere secured.
When did you show?
Oh, he saw the film was done. The film had been done for quite some time. We were just sitting on it. It was really a sad time. And yeah, so he came on, and our thinking was that we were just kind of in a lull, and we were actually looking for, at that moment, like a boost of energy and, frankly, credentialing. And to have interest from someone like him, who's considered such a great, arbiter, I think, of taste, was really, I think, helpful to us in getting a premiere, frankly. I don't know, or whatever. Maybe it made people think, again, about whether they had liked it before. I don't know, but we had the sense that it would be helpful. So we brought him on. To answer your question about the digital platform, the windows, CNN has a couple of exclusive broadcast windows, and during that,
You had shown it already at Rotterdam, correct?
no, this is before Rotterdam.
So did Josh enter into that conversation?
Sure, everybody we also had really experienced executive producers with Impact Partners and Pilot NYC, and like everyone had ideas and contacts, and everyone basically, we were very intelligent by surrounding ourselves with people that knew what they were doing. Because we wanted to stay artists. I mean, I love business stuff and but whatever, but at the end of the day, like what we cared about was that we were making a film that we felt like reflected our vision and had integrity and was our art. And so if to the extent that other people wanted to hop on that bus, we were like, yes, please, because we were interested to see how this is going to function in like the marketplace of film, which we didn't know anything about. Okay, so what was the other question you asked? CNN, the art film and CNN films. Look, I mean, we had already made the film. This is a film that we'd made that we loved. And anyone who was interested in that film at that point was like it was awesome. And it was so exciting to have an experimental film festival give us a prize and then have CNN interested in broadcasting it. To us, that was like so much more interesting than we'd ever imagined. We sort of always figured it would be one or the other. The art world will like this, or the sort of film world will like this. And it ended up being both, and that was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, CNN is a really sophisticated audience.
Oh my God,
and
we were so excited. We never would have thought of CNN as being the platform. And as soon as it came up, it was like, so many light bulbs for everyone involved was like, that is actually perfect.
Yeah. I mean, it was so cool to like talk to like Wolf Blitzer, to hear David Gergen like talking about how he identified with aspects of the movie. I mean, it just was really, I felt like these people bring a depth and richness of perspective, and they're not like aesthetics or something, you know? I mean, they have, you know, these are very sophisticated people who were really excited to see something that I think if it hadn't been in a form like CNN, they might not have seen.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that this deal was a little atypical. Typically, the theatrical would come first, and I wasn't there when this deal was made, but usually the theatrical would come, and then CNN would take the first broadcast window. So that's, from here on out, it's probably what you'll see more than.
We have time for one short question. This will have to be our last one. Let's get the most pressing short one. Yes, sir.
Who actually owns the home movie footage? You said Congress are taking it up, but do you, I mean, what are your ownership rights?
It's all in the public domain.
Question is ownership rights.
Yeah, all of the materials created by, basically any record created by the Nixon administration was nationalized by Congress, was basically confiscated and made public property by Congress in 1974, shortly after Nixon resigned. They passed a special law saying that everything created by Nixon is confiscated from
So we didn't need permission.
So
from
we didn't
anyone
need
to
any
use it.
permission. No one needs any permission. And Penny and I are in the process of putting the material on archive.org because there's 25 hours of footage, only about 45 minutes of which we used. So there's a lot more stuff out there for people to look at and use.
And I would just add, just to be clear, that I think about half or more than half the film was public domain material, so that was stuff that was created by the Nixon White House, the sound, White House tapes. The rest of the film we either licensed or made a fair use claim for. So it's just worth mentioning that like there's different.
The vast majority of the film, our usage of the material is based on fair use. We licensed only a very, very small fraction.
Mostly music.
Let's see, hold on. Was your question short?
Very quick.
Okay.
I'm just wondering the time period for the contracts that were signed with both CNN Films and Cinedigm. How long is that film held?
So CNN Films is a 5-year contract, and I believe Cinedigm is 12. I think that's right.
And then did the rights then come back to you?
I guess so. I don't know. Do you know?
There's complicated renewal options and so on. I mean, it's stuff, our lawyer negotiated that with them. So.
Honestly, I don't want to know those things.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. If
Thank
you
you.
haven't seen the film, recommend it highly.
Oh, it's still playing at IFC Center.